Today, I'm pleased to present Eileen Padberg. She's a longtime political consultant and women's rights advocate, and she spent a lifetime fighting for women and democratic freedoms. Eileen has managed well over 100 campaigns, including 2 statewide ballot initiatives. Unable to rest on her laurels, she struck out to Iraq for what was to be a brief foray into yet another democracy in formation. What she found were people to love and women to motivate. There, she helped Iraqi women start new businesses, obtain jobs, and take advantage of career development training programs. You'll find she's a fascinating speaker who captivates with her love of the subject, as she'll describe her almost 2 years in Iraq. Bringing the audience along with her and in and out of the famed green zone, we present Eileen Padberg.
Shall I start now?
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi there. In this time of quarantine, I am very delighted to be able to tell you about my 22 months in Iraq. In some of the ways, the quarantine is much like my time in Iraq. We had shortage of food. We had days where we couldn't travel. During the elections, we couldn't travel because there was a lot of fighting and willingness to shoot Americans. So this sort of reminds me a little bit of Iraq. I was there in the most turbulent time of the war, 204 to 206. And as you may remember, the war started in April of 203. So it was pretty bad when I got there, although I certainly didn't realize that when I got off the plane. Travel was restricted, food was rationed, the environment was really stressful. It didn't really catch up to me for about a month, and then it really hit me, whoa, what am I doing here? For those who don't know me, I've had my own political consulting firm for over 40 years, providing strategic planning for corporate clients and running political campaigns, including 2 you may have heard of. I was the regional director in 1988 for the Bush for President campaign. That was George H.W. Bush. I had California, Hawaii, and Nevada in my territory. I managed the 1986 Clint Eastwood for Mayor of Carmel campaign, which most people remember and think that was the highlight of my career, which it sort of wasn't. I've also run campaigns for several high-profile statewide initiatives, countless county, city, and other local elections, more than I care to remember. In addition, I have always been a passionate supporter of women's rights and have devoted much of my life to furthering that cause, whether it be to advocating for women's rights or policy changes, or sitting on numerous nonprofit boards helping to mentor women professionally and personally. So I know you're wondering how then a 60-year-old female political consultant from Orange County, California, found herself in the midst of the Iraqi war, creating and running a program to help Iraqi women participate in whatever new economy with the fall of Saddam. In the aftermath of the initial invasion, or liberation is what they called it then, the US Congress appropriated $18.4 billion for the reconstruction and repair of Iraq's aging infrastructure, mostly due to neglect and years of war. A few, and only a few, of those Pentagon construction contracts required a plan to include the Iraqi women in the reconstruction process. And when I say a few, I mean there were thousands and thousands of contracts that were let to American, German, British companies, those that were friends of the US, for various and sundry construction projects, electricity, water, schools, police departments, I mean, everything. And only less than 10 of those thousands and thousands of contracts had 2 sentences in the proposal, which no one had ever seen before. And it said to include a plan to involve the Iraqi women in the reconstruction process. And all of these government officials, all of these high-profile companies that had been bidding on US government contracts for years, none of them knew what this meant because they'd never seen this before. And so they came to me, since I'd been such an advocate for women, and they said, well, you know, you must know what this means. So figure it out and write us a plan. And so, you know, as a consultant, you never say, I don't know. So I took the time and wrote a plan. I knew very little about Iraq or the Middle East, but I wrote a plan based on what I thought most women would need. They need a level playing field, and they need opportunities to have a business. They need opportunities to get training. So building support for the invasion, President Bush promised that the Iraqi women, he would restore their rights, repair their country, and get rid of Saddam. Having been an activist on behalf of women's rights for years, I started from the premise that no matter where women come from, they need a level playing field. I believe from the beginning that unless Iraqi women had a stake in the economy, democracy in any regard would not have a chance. And I based my plan on that concept. Months later, the bidder I was working with was notified that they had won the contract and received high marks for the women's part. It's really interesting because many of these national companies did not know what they meant. And neither did I, as I said, so I just wrote a plan, you know, based on what I thought. And the board that reviewed all these plans was so impressed by our women's initiatives that they got high marks on it. And so they came back to me and said, well, you know, you've got to go to Iraq to run this program. And I said, oh, hell no, I'm not going. I don't like war. I don't like guns. There's no way. I have a business to run. But I said, I agreed I would think about it at least. And after thinking about it, I realized that in 3 decades of professional consulting in political management, government policy, and working to empower women, that this would be a chance of a lifetime for me to put up or shut up, and both as an American and as a woman. I was turning 60 at the time. I'm way older now. And I was already restless. I had the same clients for a couple of years. I was thinking about doing something that would get me outside of my comfort level, much like President George Bush did when he was 80, he jumped from an airplane. And so I was thinking of doing something like that, not jumping from an airplane, but something that would get me out of my comfort level. And I don't swim, so I was thinking of taking surfing lessons. And so it became Iraq versus surfing, and I finally decided that Iraq would be a big leap and I would go for only 6 months. Iraq was not my first brush with an emerging democracy. I had done political training and organization development work in a lot of organizations in countries then that were new democracies: Guatemala, Sri Lanka, former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and Indonesia. These were countries at the time that were just beginning to form democracies and have their first democratic elections. But this would be my first experience in a war zone, unless you count being a moderate Republican in conservative Orange County a war zone. Little did I know that I would end up staying in Iraq for almost 2 years and reach beyond my capabilities and everything I had done in my life. But, you know, typically women always seem to rise to the challenge. I looked at this as an adventure and an opportunity of a lifetime to impact a fledgling democracy, support the efforts of my country, and test my strength and commitment to helping women in an environment that I knew nothing about. So I put my successful business on hold. I recruited a young Iraqi American woman who was managing a shopping center, Bank of America in Escondido. Her parents had already gone back to Iraq, and I found her on the internet through the president's office putting stuff on the internet about how they were getting support from Iraqi women. And she had been a translator at one of the meetings that her mother was doing. So I found her on the internet and I called her and said, boy, do I have a deal for you. And I went down and had lunch with her in Escondido. And without Esra, I don't think I would have accomplished much. She knew the language and she knew the culture, and her tribe, you know, in Middle East, everything is about tribes. Her tribe was very important and very essential in Iraq and well respected. So that I didn't even know when I hired her. But Esra is a story in and of itself. her family fled Iraq in 1991. They lived in a refugee camp for 2 years. They got political asylum and ended up in Irvine, of all places. They worked hard, and proudly all of them became American citizens. They went back to Iraq. Her mother and dad went back to Iraq in 2003 to help topple Saddam and reclaim their property. Esra's father was kidnapped in November of 2005 when I was home on R&R, and we've never found him to this day. Her mother is still in Iraq and believes that someday they're going to find him, but of course we know that's not going to happen. Esra actually stayed in Baghdad and ran the women's program after I left. Esra and I arrived in Baghdad on June 1st, 2004. The war started in 2003. After 2 days of briefings in Kuwait, we boarded a C-130 for Baghdad with stops in Basra and Kirkuk. I didn't even know what a C-130 was. I had never seen one. I didn't know anything about it. The 2 days of briefings were only about don't pick up anything off the street. It could be attached to a bomb. Don't talk to any Iraqis. I mean, it was all that. It was no real training for what we were really going to be up against. We were told that the aircraft would take evasive action when landing because of the insurgents. They would fire on airplanes that were coming in. So we were handed business-sized envelopes in case we needed to throw up. Now, I want you to know that this airplane was full of probably 100 military soldiers and 3 or 4 women, including Esra and I. And we were given an envelope in case we needed to throw up. And I wasn't about to throw up in front of all those soldiers. I mean, I figured I could do better than that. So that was my only thought. There were no bathrooms on the C-130. There was a little tiny spot that was probably bigger, smaller than my desk with a round curtain on it. And if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to go through past all these hundreds of soldiers into this little tiny place where it was meant for people to stand up. So it was so I decided I wasn't going to go to the bathroom either. I was beginning to get a little scared, not knowing what was in front of me and feeling responsible for this young woman that I had recruited. When we arrived in the green zone, we were met by one of the members of the company that we were assigned to. We were taken immediately to mess hall because it was going to close soon and you wouldn't be able to eat until the next morning because the mess halls were open a certain time in the morning, a certain time in the afternoon, and a certain time at night, and then that was it. You couldn't get any other food. So the mess hall had the specific times, and the food was horrible. It was provided by KBR. Some of you can look that up. It was horrible. It was, so we ate our breakfast, lunch, and dinner there, and you would have to sign in, because KBR had to get paid by our government, and the food was so awful. I would always sign in as Elvis Presley or somebody else, and not give my social security number because I didn't want them to get paid for the food they were giving us. But let me tell you a little bit about the green zone. The green zone is 3.5 square miles wide. It's protected by the Tigris River on one side, the Republican Palace on the other side, which is almost a mile long, and the barricades all over where the military would protect anybody coming into the green zone. Within a short period of time, I went from living in a 3,000 square foot house in Laguna Niguel, which was new, to living in a high school classroom with 5 other women. For 6 months in a high school built for the children of the Republican Guard, which is what Saddam's guards were called. There were no dressers, no partitions between the beds. Bathrooms were outside and down the hall. We lived out of suitcases for the first 6 months. Our school was between the Ministry of Defense and the Tigris River, and the insurgents would bomb the Ministry of Defense, every morning about 6:30 a.m. The mortars would start coming in, and oftentimes they would land in our school ground, really close to the school. But our school was really very made of cement, and it was really sturdy. But every morning we were awakened by that mortars coming in, and my roommate, one of our roommates, was a young South African woman, and she would grab her bulletproof vest and her helmet, jump under the bed, put all the pillows on her, and you know, Esther and I coming from California with earthquakes, we barely moved. I think the first couple of times we were scared, but after that it was much like an earthquake. We were 6 months in that trailer, and I use that word lightly because actually what it was is a big container, much like you see at the ports. You know, it was a big container that they made into rooms. And after that, so that was behind the Republican Palace and the embassy, which the Republican Palace became the U.S. Embassy. We called it Mortar Alley because nightly the mortars would come into the trailer park, and the big voice in the sky would say, take cover, and we'd all run to the bunkers and stay there sometimes for 2 hours until the mortars would stop. In August, we moved into our own rooms, which were 9 by 12 that included a bathroom. You know, California law requires our jail cells to be bigger than 9 by 12. So you can imagine what it was. It was sort of like living in a Motel 6. We lived with the constant sound of helicopters and gunfire flying overhead, so close you could almost touch the helicopters. Mortars hit all around us all the time. It was horrible. There were a lot of people that got hurt, a lot of people that died, some that I knew. The Baghdad summer temperatures averaged about 140 degrees. Wearing a 40-pound flak jacket and a 9-pound helmet wasn't comfortable in that heat. Sometimes I didn't wear my helmet. I used it to carry my fruit from the mess hall, which I always got in trouble for. I couldn't complain though. Our troops wore flak jackets and carried about 75 pounds of attachables, which were bullets and guns and whatever else they wear, every day. So I didn't complain. The hot sun, no shade, they protected the palace every day, which is what our embassy was. I was sort of known as a cigar lady because a friend of mine owned a cigar company and she sent me a box of cigars every month. I would bring those cigars and Gatorade to the Marines protecting the palace every Friday, every Thursday actually, because Friday was all of our days off. And so I became known as a cigar lady. I gave the cigars out to all the enlisted guys, not the officers. I tried to keep some normalcy into my life. I'm a fly fisherman. So I fished in the polluted Tigris River every Friday morning, which is the day we had off. When traveling outside the green zone, I traveled with 3 up-armored cars. I don't know why they're called up-armored, but they are armored. And 6 big bruising British Guards or US Army Guards in Humvees. When we traveled in the Humvees, I was always amazed at that young man standing up in that turret. You've seen it on TV. He was ready to give his life to protect me, and it always made me sort of cry because he was so young, and I'd pat him on the leg occasionally. But his job was to, as we went under freeways or around big buildings, his job was to make sure there was nobody standing on any of the off-ramps or any of the buildings shooting at us. We were always told before we got in the up-armored cars that if anything happens, do not get out of the car. If there's any gunfire, stay in the car, we will get you. And of course, Esther and I knew that we would never get out of the car for anything. But they did have problems with the men. Sometimes the men, they'd get under fire and the men would get out of the car and run. But I knew that Esther and I were not going anywhere. We were going to stay on the floor of that car until they plied us out. Fortunately, we never were under fire. So that I was thankful for that. But before I go on, I want to give you a little refresher about Iraq. 27 million people, that was then. About the size of California. Baghdad's population is 6 to 7 million people. It's bordered by Kuwait, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. It's the home of the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. Just saying those names still gives me goosebumps. It's the home of Babylon and the Hanging Gardens, and it's the home to the first world civilization. The Arabs and the Kurds are the 2 largest ethnic groups. 97% of Iraq's population is Muslim. Shias are 60% and the Sunnis are 30%. The Shias are in control now. Saddam was a Sunni, and the Ba'ath Party was sort of non-religious and much more much more government oriented, not religious. The Iraqi women were fascinating. Women, you know, in my estimation, are the bellwether of democracy all over the world. And we needed the women in Iraq because they were over 70% of the population. Women in Iraq had more rights than almost anywhere in the world except maybe Israel. The Constitution of 1970 provided them equal rights, right to vote, attend school, own property, run for political office. And in fact, Esther's mother ran for political office when we were there. They had freedom from harassment in the workplace, and they even had 5 years of maternity leave, much better than what we have here. To impress the World Bank, women were encouraged to get an education. More women engineers in Baghdad than anywhere else in the Middle East. Every woman educated was an engineer of some sort. But the Saddam regime got ugly with power and brutalized the Shiites. And of course, women and children always suffer the worst in any war. Iraqi women, though, are phenomenal. They're tough and clever, evidenced by the fact that they started organizing on the very day that we were watching on TV when they took the thing of Saddam off the pedestal, the statue of Saddam. Women were out organizing that very day to make sure their rights were protected, that they got their rights back. Iraqi women expected to have a higher and more active role in Iraq, in the new Iraq, because President Bush promised them that. And we let them down from the beginning, and it was clear to me from the beginning. The US supported only 3 of 25 educated, capable women for the 250 transitional government that we put in place. Only 3 women out of 25 that were put up, we supported, we, the US. Iraqi women demanded 40% representation in their government. After fighting for 2 years, they got 25%, which is still better than ours. Land of the free, home of the brave, the US still has one of the lowest representations of women in developed countries. We're at 23.7, maybe 24 by now. We are just above Kyrgyzstan at 98%, Rwanda 39%, South Africa at 36%, Cuba at 36%, and even Afghanistan at 27%. We're at 24 or maybe even 25%. We have a lot of work to do in this country. The Women's Initiative was a 3-pronged effort, which frankly reflects women's needs everywhere. It was jobs, training, and opportunity to compete. So women made up 63 to 65% of the population, more than 2/3 of the workforce in Iraq. We couldn't afford to ignore the largest part of the population anywhere, let alone Iraq. We held seminars. Esther and I put together seminars all over Iraq. It was dangerous for the women to come to us in Baghdad, which we did. The first seminar was in Baghdad. But the insurgents would take pictures of Iraqi women coming into the green zone, and then they would be targeted for death. So I decided that we needed to go to them. It was less problems for them. Using Esther's contacts and legislative and language skills, we brought in lunch and snacks, and sometimes we're able to even pay for a taxi fare for the women. Our seminars, you know, in those days, the insurgents looked for Iraqi women who were working with Americans, and they targeted them for death. So Iraqi women coming to one of our seminars would have to take 5 or 6 taxi cabs in order to get to us and not be followed. It was a huge thing. And so we helped them pay for their taxis because it was, you know, it's $2 or $3 every time. We trained, in the end, approximately 300 women-owned businesses to bid and win US government contracts, which I believed was the key to them starting their own businesses. We broke down the RFPs written in English for women and taught them how to respond. Now, I'd have to say again that our government failed miserably on this. The contracts that were being let were on a computer, which, you know, remember in Iraq, they didn't have internet except for 2 or 3 hours a day. But if you were a woman bidding on a contract, you'd have to get on the internet, you'd have to go to the Corps of Engineers website, you'd have to find the country, Iraq, and then you'd have to find the region, and then you'd have to find a contract that you could bid on, that you were qualified for. So it was difficult for these women, no question. And so my effort was to make it easier for them to win a US government contract. The contract, by the way, the contracts were on the internet, on the Corps of Engineers, were written in English. So another hurdle for those women to get through. Their English was pretty good, but they're just pretty good. That wasn't great. So we broke those RFPs down into English, and we put them into Arabic, and that's how we took them at the seminars. We'd have the RFPs in Arabic, and we'd have an Arabic speaker, and mostly Esra would translate, and that's how we taught them how to win a US government contract. The PowerPoint that we developed for our training is still on the Corps of Engineers website, which is in Arabic, which is pretty amazing. Winning a US government contract allowed women to start their own businesses and hire other women so they could have a real stake in the economy. The first seminar we held in Baghdad at the convention center, and everyone told us, don't even bother, there's no women-owned businesses here. It's going to be men that are putting their wives up. And I figured out, so what? I mean, that's what they do in the US. So if I get 2 women that own their businesses, it'd be fine with me. I'd feel success. We ended up with 58 women at our first conference, 58 women, and they all own their own businesses. In Kirkuk, we stayed on the military base, but we weren't able to bring women into the base because of security problems. So I negotiated with the colonel and went out to the business center in Kirkuk, which was very dangerous at the time, but I felt that we had to do it. We had a lot of women who had signed up in Kirkuk, and I didn't want to let them down. The colonel in charge didn't like us when we first arrived, and warned us that he thought it was going to be a big failure. He thought we were going to be just like every NGO, just there to, get money and do a work, but not do anything heartfelt. And we were heartfelt. I mean, I figured that we had, and that I had risked my life, and I had risked the life of Esra. So therefore, we better make it work. So we were assigned a military security force that were all women. The gunners were women, the women who were in the turret were women, the drivers were women. It was pretty phenomenal at the time. And the head of the military security force was the colonel's daughter. So that was pretty amazing. We held another seminar in Basra. The security turned really bad, and we were not allowed off base. We had a lot of women who had signed up. So we were arguing with the colonel on the base of how we were going to get these women into the seminar. He finally decided that they would have to walk past the dogs, and the dogs would smell them. But in Iraq, women are, Iraqis don't like dogs at all, and women are particularly afraid of dogs. So we argued for 2 days about how this is all going to happen. And I finally ended up finding a way that Esra would walk between the women and the dogs, and we would get them through the security and into the room. It was just a horrible problem, though, because Esra didn't like dogs either, but she gave it up. Transportation problems to Basra. We talked to Colonel Bostic, I'll never forget him, into taking us. We had a lot of women who had signed up for the seminar, and because security was so bad, I couldn't get any transport to Basra. So I decided, I met the colonel's assistant at lunch one day, and I was talking to him, and so I thought, well, I'll ask him. So I called him and I said, could I get a meeting with the general? And he said, oh no, you couldn't get a meeting with the general. And I said, well, I just need 10 minutes. So he finally agreed to give me 10 minutes with the general. I walked into his office, started telling about our program, how important it was to the military in the US to look like we were really doing something that mattered. And I finally talked him into it. He ended up saying, okay, what is it you want from me? You just want to ride in my helicopter. You just want to ride in our helicopter. And I said, well, yes, but I want you to come to the luncheon, and I want you to open the luncheon by welcoming the Iraqi women and telling them how wonderful they are and how proud of them we are. And I want you to do that. And he said, well, what do I say? And I said, I'll write your talking points and you just come in, have lunch with us. And so anyway, the next day, the general's guy called me. He said, well, the general wants to stay all day in the seminar. And I said, no, that's not possible. Women are very intimidated by him or by Americans, by American men. So I can't have him stay. And he said, well, you can't tell the general he can't stay. And I said, well, yes, I can tell him. So I called him and I said, you know, General, you can't stay. He said, well, what am I going to do while I'm in Basra? And I said, well, you've got 300,000 troops down there. Go visit them. So fortunately, you know, he thought I was crazy, but that was all right. And that's what he did. And he came back, he opened the meeting in the morning and then came back for lunch with us. And it worked out really well. We were able to use the Basra airport, which was really interesting because all the airports were closed and the military, our military, took them all over. So it was so odd walking around in the depths of the airport, seeing what really happens. And so we used the Saddam's private lounge in the airport, in the Basra airport. And the women were really amazed by this, that we got to use Saddam's private lounge. And the airport had been closed for so long that it was really filthy dirty. So Esther and I had to sweep it and clean up before the seminar. So we did everything. We had little or no resources and little or no support once we got to Iraq. So we were used to doing everything. It wasn't that it wasn't that our American counterparts or men didn't support women's rights or women's activities. It was that they just didn't think it was important, and they didn't think the work that Esther and I were doing were important. So we always got short shifted, but that was all right. We made what we did. We did it well. And by the end of March of 2006, we had trained over 1,190 mid and senior level women in government, in leadership and management, in finance and budget, in English and computers, public speaking, and train the trainer. And we had no resources. So I would go on the internet at night and find a program from some college or from UN and develop a curriculum because we only had 10 days to teach women. We didn't have 2 years or a year. So we would develop a curriculum that would meet our needs and would meet their needs. And Esther would take it out into the Baghdad and find a professor who would teach the curriculum. And so we were able to do that, and we'd teach 15, 20 women at a time from either the Ministry of Water Resources or the Ministry of Public Works, which were the two government agencies that employed the most women. So I'd make up this curriculum, and the professor would teach to the curriculum. You all know how tough that will be. And then Esther and I couldn't go to the seminar because that would endanger all the women, because we'd have to show up with 3 up-armored cars and guards, and then the insurgents would know that we were there, and that would be a danger to them. So we would, I did a survey that the women would complete every night, and basically asked them if they knew how it worked, if they liked the seminar, if there was something that they needed to know that we didn't teach, how would they use what we taught in their daily lives, how would we use what we taught them in their business life, just sort of making sure that we were doing what we needed to do for them. And then we had the professors fill out a seminar, a questionnaire as well, you know, how many women showed up at the seminar, were they paying attention, was there anything that we missed, et cetera, and et cetera. So that we did that after every seminar that we held in Baghdad. I used, we didn't have the luxury, of course, of 2 years. We only had days and weeks. And those were where we would pay the women to take taxis so that insurgents couldn't follow them. And we would bring in lunch. Our seminars actually became very popular because sometimes it was the only food that the women had, really good food that the women had for a day. Sometimes we were able to bring in 15 to 20 women to Jordan for training. If we couldn't find a professor in Baghdad that could do the training, then we could go to Jordan. And at one time we did a gender mainstreaming gender mainstreaming, which I didn't know anything about. I had no idea. When the Minister of of Water Resources, who was a woman at the time, asked me to teach a gender mainstreaming course, I said yes. I didn't know what it meant. I got on the internet and figured out what it meant and figured out how to put together a curriculum, and we couldn't find anyone in Baghdad to do it. So we brought 15 women to Jordan, and we had a professor there that taught it. It was hysterical because we traveled on a C-130, and some of these women had never been on an airplane. Some of these women had never been out of Iraq. So it was funny, actually, what they thought of traveling. It was just amazing. Our most, obviously, I mean, I think about all the things we did, and we did a great job. I really feel that we did a great job. But our most important accomplishment was raising the level of confidence for Iraqi women. The feeling of true accomplishment, seeing progress, knowing that we really did what we said we were going to do, and what we did really made a difference in their lives. Helping to win over 500 US government contracts for women-owned businesses. Some of those contracts are still in existence today. That's an amazing accomplishment in Iraq. And finally, after 2 years of negotiations with the Corps of Engineers, I won approval for a set-aside, 5% set-aside for Iraqi women-owned businesses. And, I didn't always believe in set-asides, but in Iraq, it was essential because the Corps of Engineers was dealing with a whole bunch of US government contracts, US government contractors, German contractors, English, Britain contractors, all the people that were our friends. And those men had money and they had talent, and the women they couldn't qualify for these contracts. So I was bound and determined that we were going to get them qualified and get them to win contracts. So we finally set aside 5% of thousands of contracts so that women could bid against each other and not bid against these men who had lots of money behind them and lots of power. So we set out to bid on projects that were under $1 million because the women could almost figure out how to do that. They could raise the money, the initial money. We could figure out how to do it. Again, unless women participated in the economy, democracy didn't have a chance. And I really felt strongly that this was the way that women would participate in the economy. So it wouldn't be me if I didn't share some personal observations about my time and about Iraq. The US made big mistakes, not enough troops. We didn't close off the borders. We fired all the military, police, and heads of big corporations or businesses. We showed arrogance and impatience toward the Iraqis every day. It was so embarrassing to me how our government treated them, and we were in their country. Anyone that was a Ba'ath Party member, which was everybody, it was sort of like Orange County 15 years ago. You had to be a Republican in order to be successful in Orange County 15, 20 years ago. So the Ba'ath Party was like that. Anyone that was a Ba'ath Party member, which was everybody, was assumed to be a bad person. Our government assumed they were a bad person. It was like being a Democrat in Orange County 15, 20 years ago. Most Iraqis were kept out of the reconstruction process. The Iraqis that were included were those that had fled Iraq 20 years ago and came back to reap the rewards of war. Those were the Iraqis that were wealthy and that they had connections, and they had connections with our government. So those were the people that were winning awards, winning government contracts. It wasn't normal Iraqis. So, the other mistake we made, we put men out of work and they couldn't feed their families. So they turned to the insurgents to earn money for food. I mean, we put so many people out of work. We hired thousands of third world country workers for jobs that should have gone to the Iraqis. We ignored our own advice. All politics are local. We didn't invest in the people of Iraq. We did nothing to stimulate the local Iraqi economy. We imported everything. We brought in thousands of copy machines for the embassy. And every ream of paper was imported from US or from Germany or from Britain. Every can of food, every pencil, every screwdriver was imported from America. Instead of doing little things that would have made Iraqi lives easier, like a generator for each family, we fermented distrust in an environment that was easy for the insurgents to really work over. Most disappointing is that Iraq turned back into a very dangerous place, almost as dangerous today as in the height of the war. After spending $1 trillion US, $1 trillion US, and losing over 6,000 US military lives and over 150 Iraqi lives, there is still no clean water and electricity only a few hours a day. It wasn't all of our fault. It was part of the Iraqis' fault and part of our fault. We were so focused on building multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art facilities in Iraq for everything that we failed to have a plan. We sort of blundered our way into Iraq, and it was a greater blunder to get out before stabilizing, causing what I believe to be the beginning of ISIS. On the banks of the Tigris River, where I fished every Friday morning, sits the US Embassy. It is the largest US embassy in the whole entire world. It cost over 750 million US tax dollars. It is larger than the Vatican City. It's 1.5 miles long, which is 94 football fields long. It's 104 acres, and it opened in 2009 after I left, but I watched it being built. It's heavily fortified, self-contained. It has a full-size pool, a full-size basketball court, full-size soccer field, a pool with 6 lanes for swimming. It was built to house approximately 10,000 people, including 2,000 diplomatic personnel. Less than 2 months after the American troops left, the State Department began cutting the enormous diplomatic presence it had planned for Iraq. It was a sharp sign of the declining American influence in the country, I think. And to make the cuts, the embassy hired local Iraqi staff, which they should have done in the beginning. And they sourced most goods and services to the local economy, which again, we should have done from the beginning. We should have earned the Iraqis' trust from the beginning. Our operating budget for 2012 was over $4 million for that embassy. And I don't know, I haven't seen the latest numbers. I looked on the internet and couldn't figure them out, but over $4 million of US taxpayer money for that US embassy, the biggest in the world. There was so much about Iraq and my time there that I will never forget. I'll never forget Esra's father being kidnapped in 2005 and the pain and disappointment after raising enough money for the ransom and knowing that we might never see him again, which we never did. I'll never forget the Iraqi women, such tragedy in their lives, and every day, yet they could still laugh and joke and send their kids off to school, not knowing if they would see them again in the afternoon. Never forget, there was a $300,000 award on the head of an American woman, which was mine, there weren't many American women in the green zone, but 300,000, I mean, and I said to the people that I was assigned to, if you settle for less than $1 million, I'll sue you because I'm worth more than 300,000. I'll never forget being assigned a flak jacket and a helmet and a gas mask. The gas mask sort of freaked me out a little, but the flak jacket was 40 pounds and we were supposed to wear it every day. And the helmet was 12 pounds. So we were supposed to wear that every day, every time we were out of the building. I'll never forget traveling in Iraq. You know, it took us 3 days to go a distance of 500 miles. The women's program was not a high priority for travel, which I understand. The military was a much higher priority. So sometimes Esther and I would have to wait in an airport for a day, for hours, until they got us on a flight. One time we were stuck in Balad, which is right in the middle of Iraq. It was the biggest US base in Iraq. We were stuck there for 4 days because there was a sandstorm. And fortunately, a US contractor offered us a trailer and a cook. Otherwise, we would have had to stay in a tent for 4 days. I'll never forget crossing the Tigris River the first time. It still gives me goosebumps. I said to myself then that I would fish the Tigris River before I left. And I did every Friday morning. I'll never forget my first trip out of the green zone, the feeling of terror that I felt, knowing that someone wanted to kill me that didn't even know me. I mean, I understand there are a lot of people who know me that want to kill me, but someone that doesn't know me that wanted to kill me, I was shocked. I'll never forget my first Chinook helicopter ride. And they forgot to tell us that when they started to land, they would toss out flares so that if there were any bombs or any fire, that they would know it before they land. And so Esther and I thought we were hit. It was really scary. We didn't cry or scream or anything, I can guarantee you that. But we originally thought we were hit, but of course we weren't. I'll never forget standing beside the Euphrates River in Gila. What an incredible feeling. It still gives me goosepimples to this day. I'll never forget touring Babylon, the 2,600-year-old lion of Babylon, which I think I have a photo of. I'll never forget mortars falling in the parking lot of our office. In the beginning, we used to laugh that the bad guys couldn't hit anything, and then they did, of course. I'll never forget suicide bombers blowing up the Green Zone Cafe, which is a little Iraqi cafe inside the Green Zone that we all ate at occasionally when we got tired of the mess hall food. We weren't supposed to be there, but of course we always did. I'll never forget when the suicide bombers blew up the Green Zone and the Haji Market, which a lot of us shopped at, local Iraqi stuff, killing several Americans and the British, even the 10 guys that I had flown back with the previous day from R&R. A friend of mine whose son was a Marine in Iraq was wounded by an IED, and his father sent a note to his list of friends, which I was on, telling them that he didn't know what the status of his son was, that he had been hit and he had been taken to the hospital. I got the email in the morning, which was his night, and I walked across the street to the hospital and went through the hospital to find him, Brian. And there were soldiers sleeping. You know, we'd taken over the U.S., the Iraqi hospital. So there were soldiers sleeping all over the floors, all over the chairs, everywhere. And so I asked when I went into the hospital, you know, where Brian was. And they said, well, you know, he must not have been hurt really badly for surgery because he wasn't on the list. So I had to go around and ask every soldier. They were sleeping. And so I finally got to him and I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, you know, are you Brian? And he said, who the hell are you? And I said, well, your father sent me to check on you. And he started crying, this big, tough Marine. I started crying. And I took a picture of him and I and Esra, and we sent it to his father. So by the time his father woke up the next morning, he had a picture of his son with Esra and I, knowing that he was okay. And it still makes me cry. I'll never forget Thanksgiving in Baghdad, my first Thanksgiving, November 25th, 2004. We were all seated for this incredible Thanksgiving dinner that had been flown in by Americans. And there were probably 50 of us in the room. And all of a sudden the mortar started hitting and we all had to hit the bunkers. And we were in the bunkers for 2 hours while the mortars kept hitting and hitting. And so by the time we got back to our Thanksgiving dinner, of course it was cold, but we still ate it and enjoyed it. And we're thankful that we were able to eat it. I'll never forget fly fishing the Tigris River with helicopters flying overhead. And I know those guys were looking down saying, what the hell is she doing? But I was fly fishing. It gave me some normalcy to my life and it made me feel better. I did catch fish. I didn't eat the fish, of course. I either tossed them back or the Iraqis ate them. But the Tigris River was where Saddam dumped all his dead bodies, so I wasn't about to eat the fish. I'll never forget seeing the effect of government bureaucracy at firsthand. Oh my God, it was just incredible. I'll tell you just one little story. The Minister of Public Works was a woman, a very powerful woman in Iraq, and who became a friend of mine. And because she was very political, she wanted to someday be the prime minister. Anyway, so we connected immediately. Her life was always in danger. There was always somebody trying to kill her, the insurgents. They hated her. So at one point she was sick and she called me, and 2 weeks before this, her motorcade was attacked and her guard was killed. And so she was, you know, afraid. And so she called me one morning to say that she was sick and she wanted to come to the hospital inside the Green Zone, which was the best. And I said, of course, you know, I'll be there for you. So I immediately went over to the hospital. I put aside a room for her. I got Esther to get some flowers and some fruit and, you know, all the stuff that I would do for a candidate here to make them feel comfortable. And then the doctor walked in and said, you know, Miss Padberg, you can't do this. Only Americans are allowed, or Iraqis from the battlefield, but we can't have just any Iraqi. And I said, it's not just any Iraqi. She is a big person in Iraq. She's the Ministry of Public Water Resources. So he said, well, you have to have approval from the general. And I said, okay, where do I find the general? And so I found out where he was. I went over, and the woman, his secretary, said, well, you know, you can't just walk into the general's office. You need an appointment. Well, I only had 45 minutes before she arrived at the hospital. So I said, well, I need to talk to him right now. And she said, no, you can't. You need an appointment. Just then, somebody walked out of his office, and I just walked right in. I started talking as quickly as I could without any periods in my sentence, just commas, and telling him that he needed to approve this. And he stood up and he said, who the hell are you? And I told him who I was, and finally talked him into doing this. He told me how horrible it was, and how awful it was, and how hard it was, and how impossible it was. And I finally said, you know, nothing's impossible. Pick up the phone, call, get the approval. And he said, I will do it if you tell me you will never come here again. I said, okay, fine. So he did. He got the approval. I ran across the street just as she showed up, got her out of the car, took her into the hospital. She was very sick, and I got her a female doctor, and I stayed with her and helped her fill out the papers, and it was wonderful. And she said she had never been treated that way. And I said, well, you know, that's how all candidates are treated in America. Anyway, so that was my government bureaucracy story. I have many more, believe me. I could write a book only on those. But the war in Iraq had a profound influence on the Middle East and global stability and the security of the United States. And it also had a profound influence on me. I want you to know in closing that Iraq didn't define me, but it was the single biggest challenge that I ever had in my lifetime. And it tested my deepest resolve every day. The bureaucracy was so incredible. I used to say to Esther every day, we need to move at least 1/4 of an inch ahead every day. If we don't, this bureaucracy will just suck us up and we'll be like everybody else. And I'm not going to do that. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I do have some slides that I would love to show you. They're not in any particular order, but it shows you the Iraqi women, and it shows you what life was like a little bit. So I put some interesting slides together so we can look at those, and maybe then I can answer some questions. So here are some slides of Iraq. I just picked a few, but this is the plane ride from Kuwait to Baghdad. And this is Esra on my left, me in the middle, and this young woman whose name I don't remember, but she was going to be working at the embassy. And it was all of our first time on a C-130 or going to Iraq. So this was on one of our journeys into Iraq, in our unarmored cars. I took some pictures of what was going on. And this was one of the street. I thought it was so beautiful, all these fresh fruits, of which I'd remind you that we never bought anything from the Iraqis. So all this fresh fruit. In our mess hall, we had avocados that were brown. We had no fresh fruit. Our apples that would be delivered would be brown and soft. We had no fresh fruit. And outside the green zone, this is what was there. We could have had fresh fruit. So the food in the mess halls were mostly horrible, just horrible. So here it is, all this. So here's a typical scene. You know, you see cars, regular cars, and military jeeps, and then what you don't see are the big tanks, because this is the street that comes from the green zone right to the embassy. So they would come in from the war, from the red zone, down this street right to the embassy. So that's a typical street scene. Oops. This is walking to the embassy for lunch one day. So it's a bunch of the people I work with, and this was our office right here. And so we'd walk down through all this cement, and we'd walk to the palace. You know, there was The mess halls were, there was one in the palace, there was one near this place. There were about 4 or 5 of the mess halls in the green zone. And so for, all the food was the same, awful, but just for change of environment, we'd walk someplace else to go. So this was on the way to the palace. I did that one. Oh, wait, I'm going backwards. This is the Republican Palace. So it's confusing of why it was named Republican Palace, but that's what Saddam named it. It was the Republican Palace. He had Republican guards, and this was it. And this palace was a mile long, and it backs up to the Tigris River. And this is where the U.S. Embassy took this palace over, and that became our U.S. Embassy. This is the mess hall in the palace. So it was pretty. It was nicer than any of the other mess halls, but as you can see, that's what it looked like. This is again on our walk. You know, we'd have to get her. I sprained my ankle because, as you can see, the sidewalks were a mess. But this is our walk to work. This is our trailer park that we lived in. These things here are sandbags that are covered to keep mortars from hitting our trailers. These are the trailers right here. Trailers, they're, you know, containers made into trailers. So these were sandbags that were designed, if a mortar blew up, that the shrapnel wouldn't go into the trailers. This is the entrance to our building. This is the building that we worked in. And it was a former Saddam museum. And it is rumored, which is probably true, some have told me, that in the basement of this building that we worked in was a prison for political prisoners, and where they would be tied up, chained up, and killed, and beaten and killed. And I know some people that went down there. I never went down there, but I know some people that went down there and said they saw the chains where people would be locked up, would be chained to the wall. Anyway, these are our Iraqi guards. We did have Iraqi guards. So anybody coming in and out of this gate to our building would be checked. This is a typical, we'd have these drills every day, sometimes twice a day, because our building was hit with mortars so many times. And so everybody had to put on their helmet and their flak jacket and get under their desks. So this is the way I worked for. So this is our whole crew. When they had the all clear, we had to get outside and until the building, you know, make sure there was nothing inside the building that would bombs or anything. So that was our whole crew. Cute, huh? This was Thanksgiving. This was Thanksgiving before the mortar started hitting. This was, everybody was bowed their head in prayer. And then the mortar started hitting and we all had to leave. This is the second place that we lived after the trailers. We lived in the trailers for about 6 months. And then we were moved into this, which was sort of like a Motel 6, right across from our office building, which was sort of convenient. And this is 9 by 12 rooms. And then in the middle of each floor, they'd have a kitchen that you could go in and cook or do something. And then this shows where a mortar hit, because we were always being hit by mortars. So this shows where the mortar hit right there. Nobody was killed that day, but because everybody was gone by that time that it hit. This is the Bath Party headquarters, and every building in Iraq had some tribute to Saddam like this, big tributes. And this was one day I was on a tour with a couple of my friends, and this is the Bath Party headquarters, which we had turned into our post office. So it was our post office that we were using. This is me fly fishing the Tigris River. And you can see, you know, Americans have been there because all the 7-Up cans and junk, you know, Americans are great at leaving trash there. They all care about the environment, but they all leave trash wherever they go. I thought that was so pathetic. But anyway, that's the fish I caught. And I had taken off my bulletproof vest. I got in trouble for it many times, but it didn't matter to me. I always thought if I got in trouble, what could they do? They could send me home or shoot me, and they weren't going to do either. So anyway, the general caught me without my PPE gear, which is now a normal term that we hear all the time. And I did get in trouble. Here is our Black Hawk helicopter that we use for a taxi. You know, if Esther and I had to go someplace, this is what we would be flown in, a Black Hawk taxi. I never in my life thought that I would be flying in a Black Hawk or a C-130, but there I was. And I would tell you that it's really hard. It's so hot in Iraq, and in the air, of course, when we're in the Black Hawk, the doors are open because the gunners are standing on both sides with their guns to protect us. And the air comes in and it almost burns the skin off your face. I really thought that when I came back, I'd have no skin on my face. It's so hot and the air is blowing on you. And the dirt, it's so dirty. Anyway, that's our Black Hawk. This is the C-130. This is, I don't know where I was going this day, but there we are. That's how everybody would sit on this. And this is our other taxi, depending on how far we were going. So the helicopter would take us close distances or to the airport, and then this would take us from the airport to wherever we were going. This is our first conference in Baghdad. And as you can see, the women aren't in hijabs. They dress, most of the educated women dress much like we do here. So this was our first conference in Iraq where we had 58 women come. This was a conference that we did with the employees, the senior employees of the Ministry of Water Resources, and this was them, and you can see that they're very different, great group of women. Oops. This is my Kirkuk team. Kirkuk was very dangerous at the time, but we had committed women down there, and so we had to go, and this is my security guy and Esra. Oh, I should be pointing this. This is my security guy, this is Esra, and this is me, and then these were part of our team that was helping on the seminar. This is our whole female security team, which I thought was so amazing in Kirkuk. I told you about them in my speech, but this is the whole team. And that was a new business conference that they had just opened. This is the inside of it, and this is all the women that came to be trained that day. And this is a woman that we recruited from the Corps of Engineers, Daryl, and I'll never forget her. She didn't want to do it. After she did the first one, she loved it and decided that she would do them all. So she was with the Corps of Engineers, and the Corps of Engineers were responsible for handing out the contracts. So we had to have somebody on our side so that these women could get contracts. So I recruited her and she loved it after a while. This is the whole Basra team. There's Darylyn again, she's a Corps of Engineers. These are all Corps of Engineers people. So they were so helpful to me. These were the people who would get us transport, who would give us security, who would help us tell women around, Iraqi women around there. Colonel Bostic right here was very supportive of the women's program, very supportive. This is a group of women that we had in Basra. This was in Saddam's waiting room at the airport. But this is a great group of women. I really liked it a lot. They're just so incredible. This is the lunch that we provided. Now, in Iraq, they don't do that, never do that. But I figure that we wanted to make the women want to come to our events and want to come to be trained. And I wanted them to be rewarded for that. And so because Esra spoke Arabic, she could find people that would fix us lunch and get it to us. So this was not mess hall lunch. This was real Iraqi food. We became really popular. This was a group of women that we had in Diwanee, and as you can see, I mean, somebody even brought their baby, but this was a little bit more religious group down there, and so you can see most of them are covered, but another great group. This was a training that I did after I came back from Iraq. I went back to do a project for the State Department, and these were the women I worked with on that. Their job was to advocate women's rights, not the kind of women's rights we have here, of course, but just that women would be treated equally in court, and that judges would be actually lawyers instead of just friends of friends. But these were the women that were advocating to the first parliament, and I was working with them to help them get that done. this isn't a great picture, but because it's so big, but this was the gender mainstreaming. So gender mainstreaming, interesting. I never heard about it, and I'm sure many of you haven't, but because Iraq men and women don't work together, in the new Iraq, women and men were going to work together. And so gender mainstreaming is helping them figure out a way to work together, language and actions. And so that's why we have men in the group as well. Very interesting. This is at the beginning of Saddam's parade route, you know, where he would parade his soldiers in front of him. This is the helmets of the dead Iranian soldiers that he killed several years before. He collected their helmets and made just eerie, just really eerie. This was when Senator Dianne Feinstein came into Baghdad. I broke into the meeting so that I could talk to her about getting more money for the women's initiatives, because it was working and I felt that it was important and we needed more support. So I crashed the meeting and got to talk to her since I knew her aide. This is just a great photo. And I still talk to a couple of these guys. They're still friends on email. But this was the CBs, and they would build things for Esther and I. You know, they'd build a table for us or fix our desk where it would work better for us. They were always there and available for us. They were great guys. This is the Gate of Babel, where you go into the Hanging Gardens. This is a replica. The British took the original back to Britain and they have it in their museum. So this is a replica of the Gate of Babel. It's just so interesting. This is the Euphrates River at nightfall. I just thought it was such a beautiful picture. And again, the Euphrates and the Tigris River, wow, I mean, just to be there was amazing to me. And this is the parade that Saddam would parade his soldiers through. It's rumored that these hands were molds of his hands. And so the soldiers would parade down this field, and the stands were right there where they'd parade in front of him. And I have to tell you that one night I had a couple of soldiers take me over there so I could high step down that field. I just wanted to be able to do it. It was just one of the little things I did. And then this is a nighttime shot of the barbed wire was everywhere, of course, everywhere. And this was a night that we were leaving a little entrepreneurial restaurant that in the green zone, close to the red zone, but in the green zone. And one of the people with me had fallen into the barbed wire. So I took this photo and it turned out really pretty. This is the tomb of the unknown soldier. This is, Saddam built this, of course, the tomb of the unknown soldier. This is that little entrepreneurial Iraqi place. We called it the Baghdad Country Club. And it was a place where we could go. They had a bar and they had food, not great food, but it was not mess food, so it was good. And they had foosball, and we'd play foosball and just talk and listen to music. It was just a place to go. This is the American embassy. And so this is the largest embassy in the whole world. This is it right here. And it's not a very good photo, but it shows you how big it is. And I have to tell you that it's built on the banks of the Tigris River. So in my estimation, again, I mean, I was really pro US when I first went to Iraq. But over time, you know, I had to question some of our decision making, and certainly this is one of them. We built the US embassy on the banks of the Tigris River. It would sort of like somebody building an embassy on the banks of the Newport Beach on Balboa Island or something. We would be furious about it. We would picket, we would do everything, but we built our embassy on the banks of the Tigris River, prime spot. I just think we should have not done that, and Iraqis didn't like it at all. And I'll close with this. This is my book. I wrote a book. I've done a lot of speeches about my time in Iraq, which I really enjoyed. I had a little bit of PTSD when I came back from Iraq, and talking about Iraq really has helped me over that hurdle. And then people kept saying, you got to write a book, you got to write a book. So this is the book that I wrote. It's a short book. It's not long, and it's 100 and some pages. But I think it's really good, and I've had good response from it. So if you're interested, you can find it on Amazon. You'll like it, I think. Everyone I know that's ever read it has liked it. So I hope you'll get it and read it. It'll never make the New York Times best-selling list, but I thought it was good. Anyway, that's my photos of Iraq. I hope you enjoyed them. Gives you a little bit of an idea of what it was like. I have many, many photos, and that's just some that I thought you would like.
Great. Thank you, Eileen, so much.
Sure.
Laura and I had a couple questions for you, and I wanted to start out. Are you in contact with any of the women still that you worked with in Iraq?
A couple. It's really hard because, you know, they don't have computer, they don't have internet connection a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, we've lost connection. But I have connections from a couple of them. One of them that fled to the United States, I still talk to, and two that I hear from, you know, every 6 months in Iraq.
Wonderful.
And Esther, of course, Esther is here in California, and I,
Okay.
of course, see her all the time.
I can imagine you would form these tight connections. So one of my questions was, how were you treated in Iraq, which is a Muslim country?
You know, this answer surprises everybody, but I was treated better by the Iraqis than I was the Americans. Americans were so, you know, they're always so busy that they think women's programs are not necessary, don't bother me. I had a harder time with them than I did with the Iraqis. I was treated really well by Iraqi women, of course. They asked me to stay for 10 years, so I think they liked me. And the Iraqi men were, you know, just nonplussed. They didn't really care one way or another, but the few Iraqi men that I met were very respectful and very kind.
And you mentioned that there was a price on your head.
Yes.
How did you deal with fear and keep it together? What would you say was your biggest support through this?
You know, it didn't dawn on me how dangerous it was. You know, certainly when I made the decision to go to Iraq, I never thought about it being that dangerous. I don't know why. And then through my months there, I never, even though we were under attack a lot, security was tight, mortars coming in all the time, car bombs, I never really wallowed in how dangerous it was. I knew I had a job to do, and I was going to focus on that and stay focused on it, because I felt if I started getting scared, then I would not be able to do what I did. And the one time that I did get a little worried, I was doing a public speaking seminar for women in Iraq, and outside the green zone. And so it was every Wednesday, and my security guys kept telling me, you know, this is dangerous. You have a pattern here, and you know, so you shouldn't be doing it. You got to stop. And I kept saying I'm going to do it. And so one day, just as our car went under the underpass, there was a big bomb, a big mortar, and so they wouldn't let me do the speaking seminars after that. I had to quit going out of the green zone. It was interesting. There was always something, you know, there was always something that you had to think about, you know. Mm-hmm. In order for me to travel anywhere, it was a huge thing. You know, I had to get our security guy to give me clearance. He had to talk to wherever I was going to make sure I had security on the other end. It was just such a huge undertaking to go anywhere. And I remember, I'm still friends with our security guy, a Brit guy who's, he's in the British Army for like 20 years. I mean, they stay forever. And he was in charge of our security, and he always would argue with me. I mean, I'd want to go to D1E and no, you can't go. I'll check security. Nope, you can't go. You can't go today. You can't go tomorrow. And we'd have this argument. I'm going anyway. I've got 20 women down there that want to, I'm going, even if I had to take a taxi cab. And he'd let me sprout off, and then he'd look at me and he'd say, are you finished? And I'd say, yes, I am, because I couldn't go without his approval. But he'd have to line up all the security, all the either the U.S. Tanks and everything that had to go with us. He had to line it all up, and if he didn't do it, then I wasn't allowed to go.
Eileen, how do you, in reflecting back about who you were or how you saw yourself prior to leaving, how do you feel like you transformed as a person because of this experience?
I'm a little bit more sensitive to people than ever before, how people treat each other. I'm very sensitive to that. I also feel like, well, I've always been pretty aggressive in my life. I've had to be. But I feel like having done what I did in Iraq, I mean, I could probably do anything. So I've never really had to worry about that because I've always done some remarkable things, but even more, I mean, having gone to a country that I knew nothing about and doing what we did, which was really significant to the Iraqi women, which is really important to me. Yeah, I feel like I can do almost anything now.
Wow, wonderful. Well, thank you again for your time today. We really appreciate you sharing your life with us and your story about your time in Iraq. And I know that our students are really gonna benefit from about hearing your experiences.
Good. I hope they do. It was an incredible time in my life.
Wonderful.
Thank you for sharing it.
Okay, thank you.